So let's move on to customizing reports in QuickBooks. So what I'm about to show you from this point forward is actually not exclusive to QuickBooks Enterprise. This would actually work in all versions of QuickBooks: QuickBooks Pro, QuickBooks Premier, QuickBooks Accountant, and QuickBooks Enterprise. Obviously not QuickBooks Online. Everything I'm going to show you is based on the entire version, on the entire options that QuickBooks gives you on the desktop side. Why? Because the reporting system in QuickBooks Enterprise versus desktop is actually identical. The only difference is those three reports I showed you earlier, and all that list of reports that have to do with advanced inventory, that's only in Enterprise, and also the custom fields, which if I have time, I'll cover that. But let's go over these because this is actually the meat and potatoes of the presentation. So the single most important thing that I think at any point you want to learn in order to know how to create custom reports, if you need to identify what is the source and what is the destination. So what is the source and what is the destination? You also want, if you hear the word header or summary, that's interchangeable with this concept of source. And if you hear the word detail, split, distribution, or line item, that's all going to be similar to this concept of destination. Now, every transaction is going to have a source. Now, the source is not always a debit or not always a credit, but the source is like sort of where the money is coming from. Let's just call it that. So if you have a check, the source would be the bank account where the money is coming from, and it will be the perspective of that transaction from the bank account perspective. Now, the destination would actually be the expense category in the case of a check. So it will be what the transaction looks like from the perspective of the expense category. So in a check, everything above that expenses and item tab, it's all information that's on the source, and anything below that is information that's on the destination. Now, one thing that's really important for you to know, some information from the source copies into destination, and some information for destinations copies into the source. The golden rule to that is if there's a conflicting field in the destination side, when you pull a detail report, you're going to see the destination piece. But if the field doesn't exist on the destination or split side, it will carry over the information from the source part. So for example, if I pull a report that shows detailed destination information, such as the expense categories on a check, and I ask for a check number, that check number is actually not in the destination, but because there's no field on the destination for a check number, it will carry that information over. Same thing with the total date. The amount, for example, is different. In this case, the amount will conflict because in this particular check, you have two destinations, you have two split expense categories, one for 200, one for 300. Therefore, if I'm looking at a source transaction for this check, I'm going to see $500. But if I'm looking at a detailed transaction for this check, I'm seeing two lines, one for 200 and one for 500, one for 300, and I would not see the $500. And once I do some example, hopefully that will make sense. But if you can't get past this, you're going to have a very tough time creating custom reports. So this is the single most important piece in here. And if you don't understand it, put it in the comment section, and I would love to clarify that as well. Okay. That being said, let's move on to how that information actually applies to creating a custom report. So the other piece is when you create a custom detail report, you're going to have a filter called the detail level filter. The detail level filter allows you to pick whether or not you want to see the summary only, which in this case would be the source or the header, or you want to see the details only, which is the all except summary option that you see in the bottom piece. Or if you click all, it would essentially show you all debits and all credits. As I mentioned earlier, some summary information copies over to the detail, but generally not vice versa. Okay. All right. So let's move on to the next slide. And this is a really important piece because in some cases, people like to have sort of like a cheat sheet to understand, okay, depending on the transaction, what is source and what's destination or what's detail. So you definitely should print this. You should have this handy when creating custom reports. Just know that if you're pulling a report that contains checks, the source would be the information tied to the bank, where the detail or the destination will be the expense category. If you're doing an invoice, for example, or a credit memo, the source would be accounts receivable, and then the detail would be the actual sales account tied to those items. if you're doing a journal entry, this is a tricky one. Journal entry, whatever the first line is of the journal entry, that would QuickBooks will consider that the source, and whatever second to 1,000, QuickBooks will consider that destination. So when you're pulling a report that contains journal entries, keep in mind that depending on whether you query both source and destination, you may get the information that you're looking for. So that being said, I would strongly suggest that if you are doing a journal entry, that you pick a bank account, accounts receivable, or accounts payable as the first line item. As a matter of fact, I would make sure that if the journal entry contains only one balance sheet account and the rest are P&L accounts, profit and loss accounts, you always make sure that the one balance sheet account becomes the first line of the journal entry. Okay. Suresh is asking, can I produce a report with these headers? Yes. So I'm going to show you that. So this slide shows the actual filter that we're going to be working on in, which is going to be the detail level filter. Okay, you're going to click on the filters tab on the right hand side, and most of the common filters that we use are detail level, date, account, name, class. But detail level is what we're going to focus in, because that's really the most important exercise to custom reports. So let me go into the product here, go into QuickBooks. Okay, so I'm going to go into the reports menu. I'm going to click on custom reports and transaction detail. This is the most common report that I tend to produce. So we go to custom reports, transaction detail. Okay, and then the custom report box will open up, and this is where you choose your date range. So I'm going to pick, let's say, for example, this fiscal year. That will give me all the transactions for this year. And I am on the sample manufacturing file, by the way. If you want to follow along, maybe watch the recording later on, you can open the sample file for manufacturing in your QuickBooks for this. Then I'm going to click on filters here, and then I'm going to click on detail level, and I'm going to click on summary only, and then I'm going to click on filters again. I'm going to click on transaction type, and I'm going to click on accounts receivable. Okay, and sorry, not transaction type, on account. We're going to click on accounts receivable. So what we're essentially doing is we're creating a report that contains the header of all the invoices and credit memos, which is the transactions that affect accounts receivable, and we don't want to see any of the details from it. So once we click OK, essentially you're going to notice that we're going to see, and if you actually look at the invoice numbers, notice that every single invoice number is different. Okay, this is called a header report or a summary report of all the transactions that affect my accounts receivable. Now, I don't necessarily have to use accounts receivable at the filter. In this particular case, I wanted to have my credit memos and invoices both show up. If I click on customize report and I go back into filters and I don't choose accounts receivable, I'm actually going to choose all accounts. But then I'm going to click on transaction type, and then I'm going to click on invoice and hit OK. I'm going to get a very similar report. I mean, it's going to be very, very similar. The difference is credit memos won't show up in this particular case because we told it a specific transaction type that we wanted to see only, that we did not want to see anything else affecting accounts receivable. We just told it any invoices, but all invoices affect accounts receivable. That's really kind of the point. But now we get to the real tricky piece here, which is this split column. And this is the column that drives every single person that I know absolutely bonkers and insane, because it doesn't really explain really what's going on. And the problem is it's also inconsistent. Like, notice that the first transaction says split and the second transaction says revenue repair service. Okay. Why is this happening? The reason why this is happening is because this second invoice you see here, 71057, if I double click on that, that invoice only has one line. Therefore, when QuickBooks is writing, let's call it a journal entry for this transaction, it only has two lines to write to the accounting system. It has the source and the destination as a single line. Now, what I mean by writing debits and credits into the accounting system, anytime you have any transaction up in the screen like this, you can hit Control Y on your keyboard, Control Y, and it will take you to a report that will basically show you the debits and credits inside that transaction. and the accounts being affected. So we see here we have a debit to accounts receivable, and then we have a credit to repair and revenue service. So anytime that a transaction only contains a single line item, a source report, which is what you're seeing here, will show the split. But if there's more than one line item and it obviously can't fit 100 or 2 or 3 line items in a single line, it would say the word hyphen split hyphen, letting you know that it's not possible for it to report the other side of the transaction because there's multiple lines affecting it. I'm going to double click on that first invoice just so you can see there's multiple line items in there. So as long as there's multiple line items in any transaction and you're looking at a report that's header only or summary only, you're never going to see information on the split side. You're just going to see that split word in it. Now, let me click on customize report and I'm going to click on filters. And then instead of doing summary only, I'm going to click on all except summary. So I just want you to kind of just focus on the fact that there's an invoice here, 71056. And I'm going to change it to all except summary. And what we're expecting to see is we're expecting to see, instead of that one summary line, we're expecting to see the 4 item level lines or the 4 split lines from that invoice. So I'm going to click OK. Actually, let's do one more thing here. I'm going to put here NUM number, and I'm going to focus or narrow down on just that transaction on 71056. That way we don't have any other distractions alongside of it. And that's also something you can do when you're building a report where you only want to look at a specific transaction, a specific number of transactions. You just put the number in there. So I'm going to put 71056, hit OK, and there it is. So now we have every single line item on this transaction. And as a matter of fact, it's actually more than 4. And that's another piece, a really important piece to understand about reporting. Anytime you use inventory parts, QuickBooks is going to hit 3 accounts in total. It's going to hit my sales account, and I'm going to click here to the right here. I'm going to click on customize report real quick, and then I'm going to click on columns, and I'm going to type account type, because this will actually help you understand that better. So I'm going to click account type, and then I'm going to bring account type here to the right or to the left. So notice that every time there's inventory, you're going to see 3 accounts being hit. You're going to see an income account, you're going to see your inventory account, and then you're going to see your cost of goods sold. And that's an important piece. Sometimes you want to see that, sometimes you don't want to see that. At the end of the day, cost of goods sold and inventory will be the same amount, debit and credit. So you're not going to have any issues, adding up or summing that invoice, because that becomes pretty much a wash. But there are cases in which I don't want to see that. I may not want to see the cost of goods sold portion or the inventory asset portion, and we can actually, through reports, kind of clean that piece out. But let's not do that yet. We're going to get there in a second. But what you're seeing here essentially is you're seeing all the split levels, all the line item levels. I'm going to click on customize report. I'm going to click on filters. And then I'm going to click on detail level. Instead of all except summary, I'm going to click on all. So now I'm going to bring all the information, header and detail. And I'm going to click OK. And the only thing you're going to see difference is you're going to see on the top line, you're going to see now the debit, which is the overall dollar amount of the invoice, which is $34,500. You see that the account type being hit this time is accounts receivable. It's the only time you see it. And then under split, you see the word split, which is what you're expecting to do. And then you're going to see debits and credits all match up. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you don't have to necessarily show the debits and the credits that have to do with the inventory and cost of goods sold. So I can click on the customize report section. I can click on filters, and then it says here all accounts. But instead, what I can do is I want to show only accounts receivable as my source account. That contains a split that only contains all ordinary income. Okay, so we have all ordinary income. Okay, notice that you have a couple. You have all ordinary income and expense, all ordinary income expense, all cost of goods sold. You want to do all ordinary income and then hit OK. And then at this point, you're only going to see the income side of the transaction. Okay, so that's really up to you on how you want to see it. If I want to see just the income side, I want to see the cost of goods sold, the inventory piece. I want to see the debits and the credits. I mean, that's really up to you how you want to do it. Under this same theme, I'm going to do one more thing here. I'm going to click on Customize Report. I'm going to click on Filters, and then I'm going to click on All Ordinary Income and Cost of Goods Sold. Okay, and then I'm going to hit OK. Okay, and the reason why I'm showing you this is because this would be my profit on the invoice. It's this information that you really can't get from QuickBooks anywhere. QuickBooks doesn't have an profit by invoice report, but by reading the balance amount on a report that again contains a filter in which shows income and cost of goods sold only, it doesn't show the inventory part of it and doesn't show the accounts receivable part of it. This will essentially be your profit by invoice. Okay, so that could be information that is useful. You could also do that just to kind of show you if you happen to be looking at the invoice at the moment and I want to say, what's my profit on this invoice? All you have to do is hit Control Y and then click on Customize Report, go to Filters, and then under Accounts, you're going to put All Income / Cost of Goods Sold. So you're going to click on All Ordinary Income / Cost of Goods Sold, hit OK, and then make sure that under Customize Reports, we turn on a column called Balance. And we turn on Balance here on the column side and hit OK. And there would be the same, where's the balance here? That's the profit on that. At $13,000, that's the profit on that job. Okay, and that's obviously that profit is only based on the inventory parts because non-inventory parts don't really carry any sort of profit information. Okay, I'm going to show you one more thing with the same invoice just because it'll provide some context. Okay, so I'm going to click on the edit menu. I'm going to click on find. Then I'm going to click on advance. Then I'm going to click on number. And I'm going to go look for that particular invoice number. And then I'm going to search it in here and I'm going to show you with the search results, what do the search results show and how the information is organized to help you deepen this whole concept of detail versus summary. So I'm going to search the invoice number only. I'm going to click on find and I'm going to show you. I'm going to maximize the screen. And then what you're going to see on the screen here, you're going to find the search in which one line is a bold and then the other lines are not bold, if you notice that. And then you have some negatives, some positives, and then you actually have a bold and not bold. So when you're using the search screen, if you ever wondered what does it mean when one transaction is bold and the other one is not bold, well, basically the bold would be the summary of that transaction. So if I were to expand that range maybe to like 7,200 or 72,000, so we can see multiple invoices, notice that every time you see a transaction that is in bold and it contains the transaction number right on it, that's when the old transaction ends and the new transaction begins. And that bold is letting you know that that is the summary or the header of that transaction. So that becomes really useful. So if I were to click on detail level here on the advanced search screen, and I click summary only, and I'm using the same filters that I would use on a report, and click on find, notice that every transaction is bold. If I click on all except summary and click on find, you see every transaction is not bold. Okay, so that will help you strengthen the concept of summary versus detail. Okay, let's see. Let's click. Let's hit escape. Okay, someone's saying, I love the custom transaction detail report. Is there a way to have a quick link to a blank one in the top menu bar? You actually can. Let's go ahead and show you that. So if I go to reports, custom reports, transaction detail report, and I'll start with today, and then I'll remove all the filters. Okay, so there's no filters. The only thing that is there is today. And I maximize that. This would be essentially a today transaction detail report, which is actually probably the best way to get started with this type of report. So all we did in the customize is the only filter we have there is date today. So what you can do is you can memorize this report, and we can call it blank blank transaction detail report, something like that. Okay, and then this would be here under the reports, memorize reports, and I'll sit right here. Or what we can do is we can click on the view menu, and wait until that loads. Okay, so I'm answering Maureen's question on taking a report and putting it on the top bar. So we can memorize it, that was one thing, or we can click on the view menu, and we can click on this little option here that says add blank transaction detail report to icon bar. Once I click on that, and I'll click OK, it adds it. It adds it to my icon bar. The problem is I have so many things in my icon bar that I have to click on this little drop down menu to pull it. But once I click on customize icon bar, I can actually grab that transaction and I can click and drag it and bring it all the way to the top. And I'm going to put it here just to the right of home. And then I'll click OK. And there it is. You're going to see it right up there. Blank transaction detail report. You can right click, click on customize icon bar. You can go to it and click edit, and you can change the name. So let me change it to details. I don't know, something that would be smaller, that wouldn't take that much real estate. Hit OK, and then you see it up here. So every time you want to start with a quick transaction detail report real quick, you can just click on details, and boom, there you got your transaction blank with only today's date on it. Now, if I have a left icon bar, not the top icon bar, that's also going to sit here under, right there under home. So it will give you the same effect whether you have a left icon bar or a right icon bar. Okay, perfect. Okay, so that's a transaction detail report. Trust me, I got 2 to 3 more hours of content that I can cover on this, but I wanted to cover the summary report as well, because that's also a really important component of custom reports. Oh wait, actually I have a question here. Marianne is saying, how can I see the invoice date and the pay date in the same report? So Marianne, unfortunately, that cannot happen. QuickBooks will either show you the pay date or the invoice date. It will not show you both. Unfortunately, that's a restriction that QuickBooks has. So let me show you what I mean by that. Let me go to details, and let me go to customize report. Let me go to filters, and then I'll click on transaction type, and I'll click on invoice, and I'll hit OK. That date that you see here, right there says 12/15/2022. That is the invoice date. That's the actual invoice date. If I switch this report from accrual to cash, this will now show you the payment date. So let's narrow this down to one invoice here. So let's go here to number. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to answer that question in detail, although I don't have a really smart answer for it. But so we have one invoice here, which is the invoice 71081. I'm going to bring this back, let's say to the beginning of the month, for example. And I'm kind of gonna play with the payment date, so you can actually see how the date gets modified whenever we have payments involved. Okay, so this invoice date is actually 12/15/2022. If I receive the payment for that invoice, I'm gonna go to customers, receive payment, and that's for retail homeowner, and that's, let's say, 9,300, and I'll apply it, and I'm gonna date the payment itself to the 7th. Actually, let me date that to the 23rd. That'll make it easier. Okay, so let's bring this all the way to the 23rd. Okay. So on an accrual-based report, this would be on 12/15/2022. And then where's my payment? Let me go search that payment real quick. Make sure that I did apply it to the correct job. Okay, there's my payment. Let me apply it. And that was Geoff Hicks. So let me apply it to the job. Hit save and close. Perfect. So if I'm pulling an accrual-based report, QuickBooks is going to give me the original invoice date. But if I switch this to cash, QuickBooks is going to give me the, let me see, was this a partially paid? No, that's it. So QuickBooks is going to give me the payment date, as you see here on the bottom. So that's kind of the challenge that you'll have. That accrual basis reports will always show you the report as a function, the transaction as a function of original transaction date, and the cash-based report will show you the report as a function of the actual payment date. Now there are some items here that must be at zero quantity, which may be causing, the reason why it's showing like there's two different transactions there. But that's really the difference. So there's no way, there's no field here for like pay date, although there's this field here called pay date. That's actually not for invoices. Like you'll bring that in there and it'll be completely blank. That's for paychecks only. So that's the issue that most people have, is that they start by doing this and they're expecting that pay date tab to bring you the pay date. Just QuickBooks doesn't do that. It will either show you the original invoice date or it will show you the payment date, but it won't do both. And that's really a function on whether you use summary or detail. Building custom reports in QuickBooks Desktop. The first and most important sort of basic skill set that you must learn in order to kind of understand exactly what you need to do with custom reports. It's going to be understanding the difference between the source and the detail split. And this is extremely important because there are situations in which the information that you're trying to pull, the information you're trying to get out of QuickBooks in a report could be from the source or it could be from the detail and the split. And in some cases, you want some data from the source and some data from the detail split, and I'll do some examples of that. Now I'm looking at a check here, and everything that's highlighted red would be a source data field. So if you're trying to pull information by check number, by date, by amount, by payee, by checking source account, by what I call source class, by the source memo, that's going to be all the fields that you see right there on top of the checks. Now, if you're trying to pull data that is within the details um, of the transaction, that's going to be on the bottom part of that check. Now, every transaction will have source and detail information in different physical locations. It's not always, top and bottom, right? I mean, this happens to be the case for a check itself, but in different, an invoice or a bill could have data in places that source or detail split. This is something you're going to learn over time. But based on this, we're going to start by showing you an example, which is, what if I were to bring a transaction detail report for that particular check. So if you can see by the illustration here, if I were to do a transaction detail report for that check, I have three lines of information. I have the source line and the two detail lines. Now it's really important that you know that this check only has two lines of detailed data, but every transaction is going to have each line of detailed data as a transaction line, and it's also going to have the source itself as a transaction line. And the data that's on the source, like for example, the memo, and I wonder if you can see well with these slides, maybe I'll zoom it in here. But if you see here, memo, I actually put a different memo on every field so you see where that information's come from. And by the way, memo is actually a very important part of the custom report process. But I want to just go back for a second. Notice that what I did here is I used one text for the source memo, and you can't see it very well here, but this one starts with a D and this one with an M. And notice that I have different text on the memos themselves that are then going to show differently on a report. And this illustration is important to know. If you're going to build a custom report, the first thing you have to think before you even start doing reports is, wait a second, the report I'm trying to build, is the data in the source or is the data in the detail or the split? So that's kind of like the first lesson that you have to know about custom reports. Now we're going to go into what I call the important notes. This is what I could possibly summarize in 1 hour, if it's possible. If I could summarize in 1 hour everything that you need to know about custom reports, it's in this page, in this one slide. Like, so if you couldn't download the slides before because the download sometimes gets messed up, take a picture of this screen, take a screenshot. This is going to be very, very useful for you. And also, I will email, once I have the recording, I will email the slides with all this information as well. So number one, when you're building a custom report, if the report contains information about whether something has been paid or not, you have to make the choice on whether or not you're trying to pull a cash basis report or an accrual basis report with a paid filter. Now, these two things are really, really different and very confusing if you're just starting building custom reports. So it's a big difference between a cash basis report that contains paid invoices, for example, versus a report that contains invoices that are marked as paid. So let's start with this example, because obviously practical examples are always the best way to go. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you an example. I'm going to pull let's say I'm going to start with a transaction detail report. So I'm going to go to transaction detail report. Okay, so that's under reports, custom reports, transaction detail. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a random date here. So I'm going to pick 12/18, 2021 and 12/18, 2021. I'm doing this on purpose because I want kind of have a blank slate here so you can start seeing the information populate on the report as we start building it. So this is a report for only one specific date. So if I go and create an invoice, so I'm going to go ahead and create an invoice and I'm going to date it that day. That way it shows up on that report. Again, for the sake of illustrating what we're trying to do, I'm going to go ahead and create an invoice here. Let me just pick any customer here and I'll pick an item and we're going to make this, let's say $10,000. Okay, so I'm just making an invoice here for $10,000 and I'm going to go ahead and hit save, and it's for 12/18, and then I'm going to go ahead and hit close it, and then on a transaction detail report, naturally I'm seeing the invoice in there. Now, we talked about source and detail. So if I'm trying to pull all the reports, all the invoices for that day, and I don't want to see any detail data, then what I want to pull is just the source of it. So what do I mean by that? So I go into customize report and go to filters and then go to detail level, and then I'm going to click on summary only. And by doing this, I'm only going to get the source of the transaction. So I'm only going to get, let's call it the accounts receivable portion of the invoice. So none of the details of the invoice will show up in here. Now, if I were to go to customize report, filters, and go to detail level, and then choose all except summary instead of summary only, I'm going to hit OK. And it looks awfully similar. However, the difference is that this is not pulling the overall transaction. This is pulling individual line items within the transaction. So if this transaction were to be different than just one line, and I'm going to go ahead and just do a second line here, because that way it will likely make a little bit more sense. So I'm going to just grab one of these items at random, and I'm going to make this one 2,000 and this one 8,000. Right? So I'm going to make the same $10,000, but I'm splitting it into two lines just so we can see the difference between a source and a detailed report. So in this particular case, I'm looking at a detailed report, which will show me individual line items within the invoice. So if I wanted to pull data like item information, in this case, you're not seeing it on this report, I would have to enable the field. And let me just do that real quick. Let me go to customize report, and then here under the display tab, I'm going to type here item and then bring that item in there, and then hit OK. And that's actually very helpful when you actually see the item that you're selling there. So if what I'm trying to achieve here, I'm going to collapse some of these fields. So if what I'm trying to achieve here is to look at items that are sold within a particular invoice, or classes that were used at the item level, or memos that were entered in the item level, whatever it is, then I have to make sure that my report is showing detail level transactions. And if I were not to use that detail level filter, if I were to leave it at all, I'm going to see both debits and credits, and there are cases in which I want to do that and cases in which I don't want to do that. I mean, most of my customers get confused whenever I show them debits and credits. As an accountant, I love to see I love to see debits and credits, but typically, when you're dealing with end users, you may want to be just like really, really careful about showing information that is just too much. Now, let's go a little bit deeper about this whole accrual cash basis. So let's say, for example, on this report, I wanted to call this report, and then let me go ahead and click on customize report, and I'm going to start by giving this report a title and kind of building up from there. Report titling is so important. As a matter of fact, the most important part of custom reports is the title. You got a custom report with a bad title, you have nothing. You have a bunch of numbers, right? It's a spreadsheet. But if you have a custom report with a good title, typically that lets the end user know and understand what the heck is it that they're watching. Okay, so I'm gonna call this report. I'm gonna title this report "Paid Invoices for Today," and let's just make the assumption that that day is today. So I'll call it "Paid Invoices for Today." Now I'm gonna go ahead and hit OK. And there are some problems with this because this title, it's semi-complete, like paid invoices for today. That could mean two things. That could mean invoices that were paid today, in which the original date of the invoice could be some other date in the future or in the past, or um, this could be uh, invoices that are dated today that have been paid versus the ones that have not been paid. So let's just do some examples here. Let me go back to customize report here, and let me go to filters, and then I'm going to go back to that detail level filter. And by the way, this detail level filter is the single most important skill set you need to learn for custom reports. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK, and then I only see one invoice. Let me double click on that invoice, and I'm going to, just to speed things up, I'm going to go ahead and duplicate it. And I'll also date this one in the same date, and I'm going to choose a different customer, and I'll also pick a different amount just so we can have a little bit of a different a piece of information here. Okay, so a completely different invoice here, a completely different amount, something kind of random, and there we go. So now we're looking at invoices, paid invoices for today. Now, none of these invoices have been paid. And how do I know that? Well, because when I go to customize report and I go to columns and I bring up my paid filter, by the way, pay date doesn't mean anything and paid through doesn't mean anything. Just take it for what it is. Just it's paid, the only one that really works here. So the pay filter says that is unpaid. Now, obviously, this doesn't work. This report doesn't work because I'm showing it says that it's paid, but then the filter says unpaid. Obviously, there's some confusion here. So I'm going to go ahead and run the filter for paid. So I'm going to go to customize report, and instead of just showing it on a column, I'm going to go to filters, and then I'm going to go into paid. So I'm actually going to a filter called paid status, and then I'm going to put here closed, and closed means that it's paid. Open means that it's unpaid, and either would mean both. Now, really, really important. There's no option here for partially paid. So partially paid is the same thing as open. Okay, so you either have closed, which means fully paid, or zero balance, and open, which means it would have at least 1 cent of an open balance. So let me go ahead and hit close, because that would be the filter to use. Pay close, and then I hit OK, and then naturally this report no longer shows any invoices because none of them have been paid. But let me go ahead and go to customers and receive a payment. So I'm going to go ahead and go to receive payment and select. Now I have to remember which customer is the one that had the open invoice. Let me go through it. Okay, there it is. I'm going to go ahead and select this invoice, and I'm going to go ahead and mark the payment on the 19th. So I'm actually changing the payment date to a different date just to show you something. This is extremely important. This is probably one of the most important lessons to learn. Well, I say that all the time for everything, so apologize for that. So it's one of the really important lessons to learn is the payment date can truly affect how this report works. Remember, this report is dated on the 18th and the payment is dated on the 19th. Okay, so really important. So let me go ahead and hit save and close. And now my paid invoices for today, it's showing in there and it's showing paid. Why? Because currently this invoice is flagged as paid. And the reason why it's flagged as paid is because it has been paid on the past or on the future. And that's the principle of an accrual report. An accrual report doesn't pay attention to the date of the payment, it only pays attention on whether or not it has been paid. Now, this is really awesome, ultra cool. If I go to customize report, and if you weren't paying attention now, pay attention. If you weren't paying attention then, pay attention now. So there's a little tab here called advanced. This is one of the most powerful single tools, super underutilized in the universe of QuickBooks custom reports. As a matter of fact, I've talked to so many people, that do custom reports that didn't know about this particular one. So the open balance aging, which affects the aging field, it affects the open balance amount, and it also affects the flag of paid or not, could be done based on current, and current means all dates. It means if it's ever been paid, past or future, current will show that paid flag. But if I select report date, QuickBooks will stop looking at the status of the invoice as of the report date. So for this particular example, so when I hit OK and then I hit OK, that invoice doesn't show paid. Why? Because the payment date is in the future. Okay, so again, we're still on this concept that we're using an accrual report with a paid flag. Now, I'm going to do something even more interesting. I'm going to go back and do current here as well. Now, we're going to go to customize report, and then we're going to go to columns, and we're going to select open balance. Okay, so we're going to enable open balance because open balance is another really important field in this whole world of paid, unpaid transactions. And this is only useful for anything that affects accounts receivable or accounts payable. So this invoice has an open balance of 0, and that makes sense because the invoice has been paid. Now, if I go to customize report and I go to advanced and then I select report date, that means I'm going to calculate my open balance as of report date. And I'm also going to remove the paid status. That way I want to see all my paid and unpaid invoices. You're now going to see all my paid and unpaid invoices with their open balance. But what happens if I have a partial payment? That's pretty interesting. So let me go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and pull up that payment. And let me pull this payment. I'm going to bring it now to the past. So I'm going to bring it 2 days to the past. And then I'm going to make it a partial payment instead. So I'm going to make $6,000 instead of $10,000, right? So I'm making a partial payment, okay, just to show you something. So this is the same $10,000 invoice with a partial payment. And the way it shows up on this report is, okay, the open balance of it is based on the report date or based on current. We can do either one, and then we can hit refresh and notice what happens. This invoice is now unpaid. Again, QuickBooks doesn't have a flag for partially paid, but then it has a running open balance. So if this report was different, so if this report was something like, let's change the title, open balance on invoices as of today, whole another ball game, right? You change the title, change the entire report. So if this report was called open balance on invoices as of today, then I would basically get rid of debit and get rid of credit, right? Because I actually don't need that. Get rid of balance, and then I would only be showing open balances. So, but I would also want to maybe go back to a couple of years, okay, and hit refresh so I can see all of my invoices, and then go to custom report and then only show invoices. So let me go to filters and let me go to transaction type and let me go to invoice. That way I only see invoices. And then I maybe want to go back to my paid status and hit open because I really only want to see open invoices and all their open balances. So it's very important. You change the title of a report and you change the entire context of what is it that you're doing. That's why I like to pay really close attention to the title of the report, especially once you're going to print it. Now, up to QuickBooks 2017, when you printed a report, right, the only thing you really had was that title. Beyond that title, if you didn't have a good title, the report was pretty much numbers. It was garbage. But now they added one really interesting thing, which is this little button here that says show. It's actually pretty cool. That button there that says show, and this is only QuickBooks 2017. If you click on that, it will actually show you some of the filters that are there. So if you have the show enabled, and then you go print a report, and then I'm going to go ahead and preview, it's going to be the same report, again, very dependent on that title, but on the next page, you're going to get a legend saying, well, these are the filters that we use. Now, some of these filters provide good information, like the detail level, open, and invoice, but the date didn't, right? Because it had, because it says custom in there. But if I were to change maybe the dates to all, okay, then that wouldn't show as a custom date filter. Or if I were to use this fiscal year to date or something like that, then when I go print the report, I do get a little bit better information on that legend, right? It says this fiscal year to date. So it's only when in this case, when I use very custom dates, that it just says custom. Okay, let me hide that for a second. Now, staying on the same theme, right? Remember that if the invoice has been partially paid, it will still show fully paid or unpaid. And then the open balance tab will actually show you. Let me go. I'm going to go 3 days in the future here so we can see that they want for 4,000. It would actually show you what the open balance is up to that date. Now, if I were to go to customize report and go to advanced, and then I'm going to use open balance as of report date and then hit OK, and then hit OK. And then I'm going to go to this same invoice and I'm going to change the payment and push it to the future. So now I'm going to do is push this payment to the future. And what we're expecting to see, because QuickBooks is recalculating my open balances as of the report date, which ends on 12/18, is any payments that are dated after that report will no longer affect my paid or unpaid status. And now my open balance goes back to the original full open balance for the invoice. I mean, this is so many little tiny details and so much attention to detail that you have to take when building these reports, especially when you're dealing with this whole concept of paid and unpaid. And let me just show one more thing, which is my cash basis report. So I'm going to go into customize report, and then I'm going to go into headers and filters, and I'm going to change the title to invoices that have been paid today. Now, report titles are crucial, right? So if I say invoices that have been paid today, all the information that I need in terms of filters are going to come from the report. So for example, this right here, it's my transaction type. The fact that they've been paid today, this tells me that this is an accrual basis report, right? Because it's when they have been paid, not whether or not the original date on the invoice is today. And then obviously today tells me the date that I'm using. Okay, so how would I build that? So again, let's say today is the 18th. So I'm going to build a report for the 18th, hit refresh. I'm going to click on customize report. I'm going to switch this to accrual. And then under filters, I'm going to switch it from accrual to cash. And then under filters, under detail level, I'm going to click on all except summary. Now, one really important thing, and this is kind of a bombshell. If you pull a cash basis report, again, cash basis report, the only information you can extract is the detailed information. In cash basis reports, no source data ever shows up. So a cash basis report can only pull detailed data. So if I pull a cash basis report, I have to see the details of the invoices. That's so important. And why does it do that? I don't know. Also, in a cash basis report, you also want to you want to not use the paid filter, because then QuickBooks really gets confused. And well, if it's a cash basis report, it's obvious that it's paid, but then it could be partially paid. So you could use it, but generally I just get rid of it, and then I hit OK. Now I got nothing. Why? Because the payment that I received today, the payments that I've received doesn't have today's date. So let me go back into that particular payment. So let me go to receive payment, And let me go backwards. Okay, there's that $6,000 payment. Now I'm gonna date that today, right? We're assuming today is December 18th, and that's a partial payment, so that's 6,000. By the way, real quick, let's do some math. 6,000 from 10,000 is 60%. So 6,000 from 10,000 is 60%. I know everybody knows that. Just keep that in mind for a second. I'm gonna go ahead and click on Save and Close and hit Yes. And now we're going to get like really weird information. So let me go ahead and go to Customize Report and make sure that I'm showing my debits and credits. Now before I had closed them, and I should, so I'm going to hide Open Balance. Open Balance is really confusing with a cash basis report, so I just hide that completely. Now, what's happening here? I received a payment from an invoice today. Now that invoice, I'm going to go ahead and date that a couple of days in the past. I'm going to date that the 14th. But because the payment has today's date, then it will show up on this particular report because it's a cash basis report. What is a cash basis report in QuickBooks? By the way, a cash basis report in QuickBooks really has nothing to do with cash basis from tax purposes. A cash basis report in QuickBooks basically means to modify the contents of an invoice or a bill proportionate to the payment compared to the original amount on the date that is paid. Okay? Again, the cash basis report, the sole job is to grab invoices and bills, grab the details, display the proportion of each item comparing payment versus total amount, and modifying the transaction date as if it's based on the payment date. That's what a cash basis report is in QuickBooks. So notice that the date of the invoice says it's 12/18, but this invoice is not dated 12/18. This invoice is dated 12/14. But because I'm pulling a cash basis report, then there's really not much I can do. The only possible thing that I'm going to be able to see in a cash basis report is the date of the payment, not the date of the original invoice. Now, I had a customer that that helped me. Basically, they did a workaround. I'm going to show you. What they did is they took this field called ship to, no, not ship to, sorry, ship date, and they don't use it, and they changed it to original invoice date. For whatever reason, they were not using the ship date, and they changed the title, at least on this show on the report, to original invoice date. And they basically did this. They showed me. I learned this from a customer. It says, Hector, what I do is I copy the transaction date to the original invoice date. That way, when I pull a cash basis report, I can enable the ship date field. So let's go to ship date field, and so I can actually see both quote unquote my original invoice date, which is basically a duplicate of the original invoice date in the ship date field, and the payment date. Now, unfortunately, I can't change the titles of this report, so they just pretty much learn how to read these things on their own, or they export it to Excel and change the titles. But that was an awesome workaround. I mean, when I learned, one of the things I love is to learn from a customer. Like when I go somewhere and they did some weird workaround to make something happen, I just absolutely love that. I mean, it's what I live for, basically. Now, how did this 6,000 get broken down per item? It was basically done proportionate. So QuickBooks took 60% of 8,000 for this line item and attributed it to that invoice, 4,800, and then it took 60% to the 2,000 and attributed it to the 1,200. Now, one of the things that is absolutely insane about this, and I apologize that there isn't a better way, this is just the way QuickBooks works, it's when sales tax is involved. I mean, when sales tax is involved, hell breaks loose, and I'm going to show you what that means. So sales tax is particularly tricky when it comes to, I'm going to create a sales tax here. I'm just going to call it Miami. I'm going to call it Miami sales tax, and let me do 7%, and then I'll do Florida DOR, whatever the name of the vendor is, and hit OK and hit OK. Okay, and then I'm going to go back into this invoice, the same invoice we were working with here, and I'm going to add sales tax to it. And then once we look at our cash basis report, you're going to see something really, really particularly interesting. Let me go to customers, customer center, and then transactions, invoices, sort them by date. This will help me find it real quick. Where is my $10,000 invoice? There it is. I'm going to go ahead and add sales tax to it. So now I got 7% sales tax. Let me make my items taxable. So my total sales tax on this invoice is $700. Now, what's going to happen when I go back and create that report? So that was reports, custom reports, transaction detail. It was a cash basis report on the 18th. So if you missed how I did the report, it's a pretty good exercise. Filter, I'm going to go to transaction type, go to invoices, and then I'm going to go to detail level and do all except summary and hit OK. I think that was it. Yeah. So check this out. In a cash basis report, sales tax is also proportionate. This is why it is devastating, devastating, devastating to pull a cash basis report for sales tax. Now, sales tax is probably an entirely different deep conversation, a whole webinar. It varies by state, but most states prohibit cash basis as the way to calculate your sales tax. So this is why most states require you to use accrual basis, because this partial payment stuff, it just gets really, really confusing. So it is quite possible that you can file a corporate tax return in cash basis, but all your sales tax returns are in accrual basis. That's totally okay. Very, very important. Okay. All right. So that's it for accrual basis, open balance, and paid balance and detail level. So that basically covered those first three bullet points. And I think I also covered the fact that the detail reports are one transaction. So let's talk about now summary reports. Now, one of my favorite reports to build in QuickBooks. Very limited, but it is one of my favorite reports to build in QuickBooks. Let's jump to those. So let's go to reports, custom reports, summary reports. Okay, and from here, the first thing I kind of want to do is, before I jump to do a report, is I ask my client to draw it for me. So a lot of times I open an Excel spreadsheet and I tell my customer, here, draw the report for me, just so I know or I have an idea what is it that you're trying to achieve, especially when it's my customer requesting the custom report. Or a lot of times I just draw it, like I just come in here and say, okay, so we got rows, we got columns, okay? And I tell my customer, tell me what you want to see in rows, tell me what you want to see in columns, and tell me what type of data I want to calculate inside of it. So this would be obviously my row dimension, this would be my column dimension, and this is my filter. Okay, so that's the drawing version of kind of brainstorming a custom report. Sometimes if you go through Excel, my customer can say, well, what I want to see is I want to see customer 1, customer 2, like this. And then in here, I want to see month 1, month 2, right? And then the big question is, well, what is going to be here on this data? So a lot of times, we just kind of like, I know I'm doing Excel stuff that some people maybe don't know, but it's trying to avoid talking about how to do stuff in Excel. So I'm just using as an example. So the big question is, okay, so I know what I want for rows. I know what I want for columns. The question is, what is going to be here? So sometimes they'll ask you for sales. Sometimes they'll ask you for something else. Maybe it's not sales. Maybe what they want to see is, maybe they want to see profit, or maybe they want to see balance, right? So that's the big question here. Whoops. So all right, so that's my narrator turned on. Okay, so I would have to ask what I want to see. Do I want to see sales? Do I want to see profit? Maybe I want to see balances. Okay, so that's a really important one, because a lot of times your customers or your Whoops. So sometimes they're not that clear on what they want to see, right? So once I know my row and my column, the key question is, you want to see sales, you want to see profit, or you want to see balance. In some cases, I want to see expenses. In some cases, I want to see cost of goods sold. So let's say, for example, let's do this example, and they want to do just sales. So if that was the case, then I would start by building the report. Okay, so I'm going to come in columns. Okay, so according to my drawing or my sketch, this is going to be month. Okay, so I'm going to come in here and select month. Rows, I'm going to come in and select customer. And then we talked about this here. This is the filter. So if they want to see sales, then basically I come in here to filter and I just select an account or a group of accounts that make sense. And there should always be one called all ordinary income accounts. There we go. So that would be sales. And yes, you do have to know that sales means all ordinary income. This comes with practice. And then I hit OK. And let's do this by month. And let's do this all this fiscal year. Now I'm going to go ahead and collapse it because I don't want to pay much attention to jobs right now for a moment. So this is basically what the client wants. Now, we talked about titling. Like, you never want to give a report that says custom summary report. Like, you got to be able to give this a good title. So I'm going to go to customize report, go to header and footer, and give it a title now. So I'm going to put sales, or in this case, I like to use the adjective or the first one as the column. So monthly sales by customer. Okay, so this is how I do it, right? This right here tells me my column, this tells me my rows, and this tells me my filter. I want to make sure that in every report that I create, that implied on the title is the rows, the columns, and the filter. And once you kind of get accustomed to doing that, it just becomes a really smooth process for creating custom reports. Now, when I go to customize report, now we're still doing summary reports. When I customize reports, there's a few options here under columns, and there's a few options here under rows. So there's a couple of important things to learn about this. One is, what you see is what you get. The options given to you are the options given to you, and that's it. And that's it. The information that is here, it's the stuff that's in the transactions. So for example, if you have a particular rep assigned to a customer, but it's not in a transaction, it's just on the customer, it will not show up. So the data has to be on the transaction. So let me just zoom this in for a second so we can see a little bit closer. So I'm going to use this as an example here. So you see how there's $3,000 no sales rep. I'm going to go ahead and double click on that and double click on, let's say, an invoice. Now this customer is called Miscellaneous Retail Mrs. Jan Minor. So let's assume for a second that I actually had inside this customer, I actually had a rep assigned to it. So let's say I'm going to assign this rep here called JG. So this is really important because a lot of people think that because the data is sitting there on the customer attribute, item attribute, vendor attribute, whatever, it will show up in the report. The answer is no. So just because it's sitting there on my customer attribute, it's not going to change how it shows up on the report. Is still going to show as no sales rep because it wasn't inside the transaction. A summary report always pulls data from the transaction. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on that and double click on the transaction, and that's $350 or $1,000, whatever. And I'm going to go ahead and select the rep. Now it doesn't matter what rep I select, that's the rep that's going to show up on the report. So you just okay, yeah, sales tax. Okay, because I enable sales tax, I have to select the sales tax item. Perfect. So now that I put it in there, you notice that my information on there's no sales rep goes away. Why? Because I fixed it on the specific transaction. So that's key. That's a very key element of this whole thing, that the data being pulled from here, it's from transactions. It's not from the like item card or the customer card. There are some limitations. So I'm going to go to customize report and click on rows by. There's some information that doesn't specifically come from the transaction, and there's only one of them, which is right here, customer type and vendor type. Now, nowhere in an invoice you see customer type or vendor type. Nowhere in an invoice. So if I look at this invoice, pull whatever invoice up, customer type and vendor type is nowhere in here. However, customer type and vendor type is part of the customer's attributes. So that's the only exception to the rule. Where is it? Uh, where's my customer type? Let me pull it up here on the main customer. And let me find my customer type. There it is. So my customer type, whatever it happens to be in there, that is not going to be on the transaction. That's going to be on the customer attribute. So that's almost tied to the customer itself. So if I go display rows by customer type in this particular case, it's going to sort them or group them by customer type. Another really important lesson to be learned on this particular situation is that I cannot cross similar fields in rows and columns. So for example, if I use customer type here, I can't use customer up here. Like it will give me an error, right? I can't cross similar data fields. Same thing if I do, for example, customers in rows and rows as vendors, it won't let me do that either. So if I can't cross names or vendor or customer types in these, so that would be a limitation that you have, and you would actually have to build it in Excel or something like that if you need a report that contains this type of information. Now, okay, so that's summary reports. There's one last one, which is list reports, and this is actually a very interesting one. A report that's not used very often. So I'm going to go to reports and I'm going to go to list. And a list report doesn't contain any transaction information. It only contains information about an item, an account, a customer, vendor, or an employee. But it's really, really useful. So for example, if I were to start with a customer contact list, okay, and I wanted to kind of display all my customers by state or by customer type or something like that, I could do it simply like this. I'm going to go ahead and disable all the fields here, and I'll just select customer, and then I'm going to select state and hit OK. And that's it. You get a simple report of customers by state. Now, one of the things that's a little bit confusing sometimes is that list reports do contain balance information. So a customer contains a running balance, an item contains a quantity on hand, a vendor contains a running balance. Now, this running balance cannot be modified by date. So I can't tell it balance as of yesterday, as of today, as of tomorrow, as of last month. Anytime that we're working with a list report, the balance is going to be based on all dates. So if it's got future transactions in there, those will be included, and that cannot be modified. Unfortunately, that's just a limitation that QuickBooks has when you're dealing with custom list reports. Now, last thing I want to do is, and this is likely something that type of course that should be more than an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever. But I'm going to cover a few more things, the ones that I have here, up to the top of the hour. So I only got a few minutes here. First thing I'm going to show you is, and if you've never ever been to one of my classes, either a live class or a class in a conference, you've never heard this before, and you probably never really saw QuickBooks this way. One of the best things I learned from a customer is what I call hashtagging. So hashtagging is a technique used to add information to a transaction in which you want to show it in a report for whatever specific purpose. So for example, let's say I'm looking at this check here and I wanted to tag it in a certain way that I can pull a custom report with this transaction without it being confusing. Okay, so let's say, for example, I'm going to tag this review. So I type the word review and then I put a hashtag in front of it. Now, the reason why I do that is because I use the word review in a lot of my invoices. So I don't want to search review, just the English word review. I want to search hashtag review. So I'm going to go ahead and take maybe another invoice of some sort. So I'm just taking, in this case, a check and an invoice. I'm going to come down here in the memo, and I'm also going to hashtag this review. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save and close. And what I do is I create a report that only pulls the transactions that have been tagged. So I'm going to go to Control F, which is the same thing as going into Edit, Find, and then I'm going to go into Advanced, and then I'm going to go down to Memo, and then I'm going to type hashtag review, and then I click on Find. And then I'm going to click on Report, and I basically created a custom report that contains transactions that I tagged in a very specific way. And then I can just call this my hashtag review report. Now, this could be used for any context, like something I need a receipt for, something I need my boss to see, something I need to review later on, something I want my accountant to see, but I don't want to change the nature of the transaction. I don't want to change the account. I don't want to put it in as my accountant, whatever, right? So, I want to use this, and then once I'm done, once I don't want to see it in this report anymore, I just come in here and I delete my hashtag, hit save and close, and it doesn't show up on the report anymore. All right, so that's it. Now I'm going to do an example in Excel, and let me jump into when to use Excel for reports. Now, before I do this, I don't want to forget this link here, bit.ly/custom reports. If you haven't seen this already, you may get mind blown or not. I don't know. I don't know if you're a nerd like me, but this is something that I recently made public, which is a spreadsheet that I have been building over years, where I actually record what data fields work on which reports, right? So whether they work in a summary report, whether they work in a detailed report, and whether they're available as a row, as a column, or as a filter. So a lot of times when my clients tell me, hey, can QuickBooks do this? Can QuickBooks do that? Is there a way to create a report that's available to do what I'm trying to do, instead of just jumping into QuickBooks and try to figure out whether it works or not. I just consult this real quick. Sometimes I print it in front of my client and tell them what is it that we have access to, right? Because sometimes you don't have access to all the fields. But it's a great cheat sheet. You can print this. I put it on the handout section as a PDF. Somebody's saying here, mind blown. Yeah. This is the website, bit.ly /custom reports, all in uppercase, and I put that in the chat section, so you should be able to click straight from the chat, or just take a picture of this. But and this has been made public as of recent. I made it public about 2 months ago for a custom reports class I did for CPA Academy, and I've had, it's actually been a really positive thing, because people have emailed me telling me, Hector, you missed this particular filter, it doesn't work here. So I've been able to sort of crowdsource some of this information. So I've made this even better over time. So anyway, so just check it out, explore it on your own. Send me an email if I missed something. Don't send me emails asking me what it means. If you don't understand it, then sorry, you have no business doing custom reports. But send me an email if you see that I missed something important, because I obviously want to make this better, and I want to leave this spreadsheet up, and I'm going to be updating it as I go, and I'll tag it, right? So trust me, when you're building custom reports, that comes in extremely handy. All right. Okay, so let's jump onto why or when I will use Excel. So these are my important bullet points into when to consider using Excel. So number one is formatting that QuickBooks can't do, such as collapsing column subtypes. I can explain that. It's one of my huge pet peeves, that QuickBooks doesn't do that. Something you can only do in Excel. Anytime you want to use maybe the vendor or customer job as a source detail type of stuff, as I mentioned, QuickBooks cannot do that. And anytime I want to create a pivot table because I want to get additional dimensions or dimensions that are not available in QuickBooks. Now, my favorite report to use for pivot tables is called Transaction List by Date, and with the detail level all except summary turned on. Right? So I know that's a mouthful, but that's my favorite way of pulling a custom report that I'm going to go ahead and do a pivot table for. Okay. All right. So just keep that in mind, and then based on this, that's how we're gonna that's the reports that we're gonna build in Excel. So let me go ahead and open up QuickBooks, and then I'm gonna start with the report I mentioned. So I'm gonna go to Reports, um, no, accountant and taxes, and then transaction list by date. Now, this report is extremely similar than reports, custom summary, transaction detail. People ask me all the time, why do you have to use something different than the detail? It's because the detail has a sum in the bottom. So it actually has a summation, it has a total, subtotal. And the transaction list by date does not. Now, I know for most people it's like, oh, I don't understand what the value of that is. Well, I tell you what the value is. I don't have to delete it. So it's one less thing that I don't have to delete in Excel, right? I mean, as little as little deleting I can do in Excel, or avoid doing macros or some crazy stuff like that. I would use that one. That's actually one of my favorite ones to avoid having any subtotals. And there's other reports like the quick reports and stuff like that that don't do subtotals, but for the context of doing maybe a pivot table, I would start with transaction list by date. So maybe I can close that. Okay. And let's say, for example, I want to do a report where I actually mix information from vendors and customers in bills and checks. So I'm going to go ahead and go to customize report, go to filter. I specifically said that the detail level needs to be all except summary. Okay, same rules apply for cash basis reports. You have to use this. And then let's say under dates, I'm going to go ahead and put all. And then I'm going to go to transaction type, and I'm only trying to get information from checks, credit cards, and bills. So I'm going to click on modify transaction type, and I'm going to select check, bill, and credit card. So these are the only places in which I would have a vendor and a customer job at the same time. Let me go ahead and hit OK. And there it is. Okay, now what do I mean by this? Let me just show you real quick. Is I may have a bill that contains up here the vendor's name, and it contains in each line item a customer's name. And because I mentioned that it's not possible to do a rows and columns report that contains the cross section between customers and jobs, I may need to do this in Excel. This is just one example of stuff that I may want to do in Excel. Now, I also need my transaction list by date to contain both the source of the transaction and also the detail of the transaction. So we'll go back into this particular bill, the first one we're looking at. Notice that there's a customer job on the first line, the $180 line, and my customer job is Thomson Lightning, and my bill's name is Peacock Bulb. When I look at this report and I'm seeing the bill, it says here name Peacock Bulb. I just see it right there, Peacock Bulb, right? And I think I said that I wanted the let's do, where's my detail level? Let me do all for a second just to make sure that I'm okay here. Okay, so I got my detail level, and then I'm going to go into customize report, and then I'm going to also show what's called the source name. So I need to enable the column for source name and the one for name. So then what ends up happening is I get both the vendor's name and the customer name on the same report. For some reason, it's not showing up in here. Let me try something else for a second. Let me go to reports, custom reports, transaction detail report. Let me just make sure that I'm not making a mistake in the process. Let me go to filter, transaction type, try this again, check, bill, and credit card. Hit OK and OK. All right. Then I'm going to go into customize report, make sure I'm showing the name and the source name. Okay. And then I'm going to just double click on one of these checks and select the customer job in here. Okay. Sometimes the transaction detail report contains more information that the transaction, the detail by date. It all depends on how the report is being constructed in this case. So as we start seeing some of the information from here, notice that, okay, so this is a good example here. So notice that I got my customer name and my vendor name. So if I ever wanted to pivot this information, I would have to then, have both of those pieces of information showing in there. So then when I export this into Excel, I can now create a pivot table. And by the way, I have a whole video on pivot tables. So you may want to check my YouTube channel for that. But this may be one of the reasons why you may need to pivot information out of QuickBooks. Let me just show 1 month, that way we're not waiting for all the information to be transferred. So this particular one was an example that I had to do a transaction detail report to be able to see both. Let me just double check here, put my customer's name. Okay, I just need to make sure that I'm seeing both a customer name and the source name. Okay, perfect. So let me export this into Excel. And I also want to save you some time. There's a little button here called Advanced. You may want to get rid of this thing called space between columns. That's not useful at all. So, and also get rid of this thing called Include QuickBooks Export Guide, whatever, and then hit OK. So when you're exporting detailed information, you may want to get rid of that. That way you're not sitting there deleting line items. Now, unfortunately, because I'm using a detail report and not a transaction date report, I do have a subtotal at the end that I would have to get rid of. But for whatever reason, it wasn't happening, and I'm on a live webinar, so I switched to my default report. So I have to clean it up to make sure that I have no headers and I have no totals. Okay, these totals are a problem anytime you create a pivot table. So I'm going to delete that. So as long as I have a flat file, no headers, no totals, then I can just simply, and no blank spaces either, then what I can simply do is create a pivot table straight from here. Okay, and again, check my YouTube channel for pivot tables. But something I can do is I can grab name and source name, and I can put name under columns. I can put source name on the rows. I mean, I can fix it whatever way I want to. And then maybe I take my credit amount or debit amount, whatever information I'm trying to pull, and put it here under values. And let me just change something here real quick to sum. Again, if you're new to pivot tables, check out my YouTube channel on that. I have a few of that. So if I ever wanted to like sort of cross customer information and vendor information, let me see where my customer information is in here. It was Thompson, right? Something like, wasn't it Thompson? I forgot what the customer's name was. So it's a good example here. Kern Lightning, that's a customer. So if I ever wanted to see a cross between, in this case, between a customer data point and a vendor data point, something like that would work. Now, this is probably not the best example, right? Crossing customer and vendor information. There's other examples, like maybe a custom field, something that I can't pivot from in a summary report, or some other pivot point. For example, let me go down and look for what I think is a very important custom field here. I'm going to go down here and show you. This one's called account type. There it is, account type. Very important custom field. Okay, account type is whether or not the transaction is hitting a bank, an expense, whatever the account is. It's just the general account category. Now, in a summary report, unfortunately, let me show you right here, I can group by account list, but I can't group by account type. So that's an issue sometimes. Sometimes I don't want to see 17 income accounts. I just want to see whether it's an income account or not. And this is a good example of something I can pivot quite well in Excel. So I'm just doing the example again. Export that to Excel. And I'll just do a quick pivot table, and then we'll wrap it up there. Because trying to do something in Excel in a rush is not that useful. But still got 450 people in the webinar, so some of you may see this as valuable. Okay, so let me come in here, clean this up, delete that, and then delete the last one. Very important, because it contains that piece of information we don't need. And let me go now into insert pivot table. And then let's say, for example, I wanted to now grab that account type and use that as my rows. Okay. And then I wanted to take now my debits and put them here under values, and credits and put them here under values. And let me just make this a little bit more visible. I have to make sure that this is summing them up and not counting them. But I'm going to show you an example of how this could be useful. So for example, I got a report that only supposed to contain Let me just double check here. Checks, credit cards, and bills, right? And I wanted to find out whether or not this there is a check, credit card, or bill affecting, for example, an income account. Right? In this case, none of them are affecting my income account, which is a good thing. But then I got, for example, some checks, bills affecting my equity account. Or I got some affecting my cost of goods sold account. Or I got some of them affecting my current asset account or my current expense account. This is really, really interesting. And then once you pivot information like this, you can do things that are even more interesting, like doing more than one dimension. So I got one dimension that's not even available in QuickBooks. And then I got a secondary dimension, which is impossible to do in QuickBooks. So let's say, for example, I grab my source name and I make it my second dimension of rows. So now I got, all my vendors in this case that are affecting my accounts payable. And then I got all my vendors affecting my bank. And then I got all my vendors affecting cost of goods sold. And then I have all my vendors affecting my expense, or all my vendors affecting equity, whatever it happens to be. But what's really neat about this is once you start pivoting information, then you can actually double click on any of these numbers and Excel will create a table with the raw data that I exported from QuickBooks, just with that information. Something that maybe I can build with QuickBooks if I know what I'm looking for. But when you export the raw data and do pivot tables, you may discover information you didn't know what you were looking for, right? Yeah. So let me to do one more thing here. I'm gonna go to my YouTube channel and make sure I clarify which video that is. So if you actually just search YouTube and put Hector Garcia pivot tables, there's one video that should be roughly about an hour long or 30. There's a few here, right here. This one's 38 minutes long. So if you go to this one, it's a pretty in-depth look at VLOOKUP and pivot tables, two really important things that may show you some practical examples on why you would export the data into Excel.